This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Burundi's government announces the death of President Pierre Nkurunziza. Uganda agrees to release 79 Rwandan detainees as part of efforts to normalize relations. And we bring you the latest on the global battle against the coronavirus as the death toll in Africa passes 5,300. This is CGTN. Welcome to Africa Live with me, Beatrice Marshall, in Nairobi. We'll bring you the details on those stories in just a moment, but first, here's Uche Okoronko with the day's business headlines. Uche.
Thank you, Beatrice. And here's a look at what's coming up on Africa Live Biz. Emirates lays off hundreds of its employees in a second phase of job cuts. And the city of New York reopens after nearly 3 months of lockdown. Of course, more on that coming up within the program. For now, it is back to you, Beatrice.
Uche, thank you. Burundi's President Pierre Nkurunziza has died of a suspected heart attack at the age of 55. He passed away at the Karusi 50th Anniversary Hospital on the 8th of June. Nkurunziza has been in power since 2005. He was due to be replaced by Evariste Ndayishimiye, who won the country's presidential election conducted in May this year.
Pierre Nkurunziza was born in 1964 in the province of Ngozi. His father, a former governor, was killed in 1972 and was a Catholic, and his mother's Anglican. He has left behind his wife, Denise Bakumi Nkurunziza, who is currently serving as a Burundian minister and as the First Lady of Burundi since 2005. The couple got married in 1994 and have 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. Before the civil war, Nkurunziza, who graduated in sports education, was a teacher and assistant lecturer at the University of Burundi. He coached the army football team, Muzinga, as well as the Union Sporting, a Burundian first division team in the 1990s. Pierre Nkurunziza was appointed Deputy Secretary General of the National Council for the Defense of Democracy Forces for the Defense of Democracy in 1998. It's currently the ruling party in the country. In 2001, he was elected the chairman and re-elected again in 2004. In late 2003, he was appointed Minister for Good Governance in the transitional government of President Domitian Ndayishimiye. Following a series of party victories in elections held during June and July 2005, Nkurunziza was nominated as the party's presidential candidate. He was then elected president by members of parliament in August 2005 and took office the same month. Pierre Nkurunziza, a former Hutu rebel leader, became the first president to be chosen in a democratic election since the start of Burundi's civil war in 1994. He was re-elected in 2010 with more than 91% of the vote. This was amidst an opposition boycott. He was sworn in for a second term in office in August 2010. In 2015, Nkurunziza was nominated by his party for a third term in office. He survived a coup attempt in May. Former army loyalist Floyd led the attempt to overthrow him. The opposition said that Nkurunziza's bid to extend his term was unconstitutional. His allies, however, said his first term did not count as he was elected by parliament, not directly by the people. In 2020, Burundi's president decided to retire. The country's parliament voted to pay $500,000 to the president and provide him with a luxury villa upon leaving office. The draft law was presented to cabinet for approval and was also awarding a lifetime salary. On 9th June, in a statement posted on Twitter, the Burundian government announced the death of Pierre Nkurunziza. He died from a suspected heart attack at the age of 55. According to the online statement, he was taken to hospital on Saturday evening after falling ill. Nkurunziza died in a hospital in Karusi, eastern Burundi. The government has declared a period of national mourning for 7 days. Sadiq Shaban, CGTN.
At least 79 Rwandans have been released by Ugandan authorities after spending months in detention. The This is part of the efforts to normalize relations between Uganda and Rwanda. The two sides have traded accusations of interference in each other's affairs for months now. CGTN's Isabel Nakiria has that report.
The group is part of hundreds of Rwandans that Uganda promised to set free during a meeting with Kigali authorities last week. They are expected to be released in 5 batches. The first group has already arrived at Rwanda's Kachitumba border, while the other groups will be received at the Chaninga border. The meeting that was attended by the foreign affairs ministers of both countries and mediated by Angola and the DR Congo was held by video conferencing. Uganda says other 310 Rwandans accused of capital offenses will remain in detention pending investigations. Rwanda has been accusing Uganda of illegally detaining its nationals, while Uganda alleges Kigali was sending in groups to spy on it. The row forced Rwanda to close its border with Uganda in February 2019, advised its citizens not to travel to Uganda. The two countries have been holding a series of meetings, and the latest developments could probably lead to a lasting solution. Isabel Nakiria, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has called for strengthening China and the European Union's comprehensive strategic partnership, especially in a post-pandemic world.
With this strategic dialogue, we will be able to prepare for what's next on the China-EU political agenda. We look forward to exchanging views on areas of common concern and to enhancing mutual understanding and trust.
The Chinese foreign minister said bilateral ties in the past decades have been marked by cooperation and consensus. He noted that both sides support multilateralism and are committed to maintaining the UN-based international system. China and the European Union have a long-term strategic partnership based on mutual respect and dialogue that seeks common ground in resolving differences. Wang Yi called for continuous high-level exchanges and joint efforts in tackling the coronavirus pandemic, as well as reviving economic activity. It's been a year since the outbreak of mass protests in Hong Kong. Chief Executive Carrie Lam has called for stability.
Everybody has to learn a lesson. Hong Kong cannot stand by such chaos. The people of Hong Kong want a peaceful and stable environment. In light of the global economic recession due to the pandemic, more than ever we need a stable environment in order to restore people's normal lives.
Hundreds of protesters rallied in central Hong Kong to mark the occasion. They gathered in shopping malls despite a ban on gatherings of more than 8 people due to the coronavirus pandemic. The one-year anniversary also comes nearly 2 weeks after China's legislature approved a national security law in the special administrative region to counter foreign interference and secession. Iranian authorities say they're going to execute a man who allegedly leaked information to foreign intelligence, which led to the killing of a top Iranian general. Tehran has identified the man, Sayyid Mahmoud Mousavi Majid, as an Iranian citizen who it says worked as a spy for the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency and Israel's Mossad spy agency. Qasem Soleimani was killed by a U.S. drone strike in Iraq in January. Washington blames Soleimani for masterminding attacks on American forces in the Middle East. His assassination infuriated Tehran, which retaliated with a rocket attack on an Iraqi base where U.S. forces were stationed. No troops were killed, but hundreds were later diagnosed with traumatic brain injury. Africa has recorded more than 195,000 coronavirus cases with more than 86,000 recoveries. Africa continues to record the lowest death toll globally, and it currently stands at just over 5,300. With many countries on the continent easing their lockdown measures, governments are urging citizens to eat healthy, maintain physical distancing, and exercise good hygiene habits. Well, Northern Africa has recorded over 56,000 coronavirus infections. Egypt accounts for over half of these cases in the region. They have 35,000 cases. 5 more doctors have succumbed to the coronavirus, raising the total number of deaths among doctors to 52. Now, the Egyptian Medical Syndicate says it is doing its best to provide all medical staff with the right protective gear and medical equipment as they tackle the coronavirus pandemic. In West Africa, Nigeria has over 12,800 cases of COVID-19. The country has recorded over 360 deaths. The health ministry there says 60% of the deaths in the northern Kano state are likely due to the coronavirus. But the Kano state government says the deaths were caused by complications from hypertension, diabetes, meningitis and acute malaria, and not the COVID-19 pandemic. Kano state entered a lockdown in April to stem the spread of the virus. The federal government said this month it would ease the lockdown. In East Africa, there are over 22,000 cases of coronavirus. Sudan has the highest number in the region with over 6,000 infections. It is followed by Djibouti, which has over 4,000 cases. In Khartoum, though, many Sudanese are demanding an end to the national lockdown. Workers in the informal sector say the government extended restrictive measures without addressing their core economic needs. Businesses, markets, schools and mosques have been shut for nearly 2 months, and some Sudanese do not have a source of income as a result. While the Central African region has recorded over 20,600 cases of COVID-19. Cameroon, which has over 8,000 infections, has the highest number of cases there. Cameroon has eased its coronavirus restrictions and allowed airports, schools, bars and restaurants to reopen. The government is being accused of taking the pandemic too lightly and putting the population in harm's way. And let's now take a closer look at the Southern African region, which has over 53,000 cases. South Africa has the bulk of these figures with over 50,000 infections. Health Minister Zweli Mkhize says the total number of deaths is 1,080. President Cyril Ramaphosa says more than half of the cases have been recorded in the past 2 weeks following the easing of restrictions. Well, let's take a closer look at Nigeria, where health officials are reporting that almost 60% of mystery deaths reported in Kano State are linked to the coronavirus pandemic. A total of 979 people have died recently in 8 municipal local government areas. This was at a rate of 40 victims per day, the typical rate being roughly 11 deaths in 24 hours. A team sent to investigate the deaths in the northern state filed these numbers after conducting autopsies. Authorities are now saying that the cause of the sudden spike may have been triggered by COVID-19 in the face of pre-existing conditions in the patients. The peak occurred in mid-April. However, by May, the death rate had returned to normal. Kano State entered a lockdown in April to curb the spread of the coronavirus and was expected to ease restrictions this month. You're watching Africa Live. Still ahead on the program. Demand for used clothes in Nigeria drops amid fears of a spread of COVID-19. And after months of climate-related disasters, Somalia's food supply chain hit again by COVID-19 pandemic.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. You got to get out, go there, and you'll find them. In the bazaars of Casablanca, among the crowds in Cairo,
who come to visit Cairo, the ancient capital of Egypt.
Along the waters of the Nile, along the sands of the Sahara. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. No one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
The Democratic People's Republic of Korea has announced it will cut off all communication channels with Seoul. The state media reports that this would be the first step in shutting down all contacts with South Korea. It says the decision was made by Kim Kim Yo-jong, the sister of the DPRK leader Kim Jong-un, and a top military intelligence chief. The move comes after days of warnings for what Pyongyang calls Seoul's failure to stop anti-regime leaflets from crossing the Korean border. South Korea has responded, vowing to continue working towards restoring peace on the Korean peninsula. Bilateral relations have been strained amid a deadlock in nuclear talks between Pyongyang and Washington. Joseph Kim has more.
It's unclear whether the DPRK really did cut off the phone lines. South Korea has said that there's still dial tones and that it is ringing, but at the current moment, Pyongyang isn't answering its phone. But whether it comes as a surprise, it does come after days of where the DPRK for the past several days lashed out at Seoul, threatening to close all joint inter-Korean offices and projects if the government did not stop defectors from sending anti-Pyongyang leaflets across the border. And the DPRK also vowed on Tuesday morning to sever hotlines with South Korea as its first step to cutting all means of communication with Seoul. And on top of contact, Pyongyang also said that it would scrap the inter-Korean military deal, even though Seoul had promised to take legislative measures, announcing that it would push a new law that would ban activists from flying leaflets into the DPRK. Inter-Korean relations have remained on ice since talks have broken down between Washington and Pyongyang last February, and this is another setback for relations for denuclearization on the Korean peninsula, especially since South Korean President Moon Jae-in has been pushing to try to restart better inter-Korean relations. The DPRK has remained silent on all of South Korea's offers for cooperation and talks since last year, and now, according to its state media, Pyongyang will treat Seoul as an enemy.
The United Nations mission in Mali has registered its first 2 COVID-19 related deaths. The farewell ceremony in honor of the 2 soldiers took place at the UN mission headquarters in Bamako in the presence of political and diplomatic authorities. CGTN Sadiq Shaban has more.
The remains of the 2 deceased peacekeepers crossed the courtyard of the United Nations mission headquarters in Bamako for the last time. Carried by their brothers in arms, the coffins of the soldiers were then installed for the final tributes.
There is no doubt that he accomplished and carried out the assigned task on an exceptional basis, demonstrating a high standard of work as a professional military officer.
Only about 30 civilians and 1,000 military personnel were allowed to take part in the farewell ceremony. Representatives of the Salvadorian and Cambodian contingents of the United Nations peace operations deployed in Mali commended the bravery of the 2 peacekeepers. They also recalled the circumstances surrounding their demise.
He got sick on May 14, 2020, with the diagnosis of positive COVID-19 on May 19, 2020. Since then, his condition has drastically gotten worse and worse, despite our medical team tried the best effort to survive by sending him for the medical treatment.
The peacekeeping mission in the country is expected to continue despite the risks associated with COVID-19.
These deaths of our fellow peacekeepers remind us of the many ways in which our mission is dangerous. The threats are numerous and always imminent. As we set forth unrelentingly and committed to our duty, and the sacrifice of our fellow peacekeepers will but strengthen our resolve. We've taken extensive preventive measures to curb the spread of COVID-19. Still, we need to do a lot more.
As of today, we have recorded more than 100 positive cases, including MINUSMA and agencies. I would therefore like to take this opportunity to return to all MINUSMA staff, in particular enough uniformed personnel in Bamako and in the region, the importance of complying with the measure in force, namely the wearing of face masks, social distancing, and lockdown.
The bodies of both peacekeepers will be repatriated to their respective countries of origin, where they'll be buried. The United Nations says Mali's MINUSA mission stands as the most affected in Africa so far, with 90 cases of coronavirus, including 43 recoveries. Sadiq Shaban, CGTN.
Chinese medical experts are helping educate a group of Sudanese citizens about COVID-19 and teach them basic protective measures. Sudan has the highest number of coronavirus patients among Eastern African countries. CGTN's Ho Weiwei has more.
Do you know how long we have to wash hands? What is the time?
20 to 40 seconds.
Whoa!
You're great.
Very.
How to count it?
How to count it?
Yeah.
We can sing a song.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Again. Happy birthday to you.
Yeah.
The 2-hour session was held for Sudanese workers.
There's a lot of things that we need to do, and we need to prevent ourselves from doing. Social distance, how to be safe, wearing the masks.
The Chinese are part of a medical team of experts here to give advice and answer questions.
The severity is based on many factors. For example, if we can't go to the hospital earlier and we can't monitor the patient earlier, and maybe the severe will get worse and the patient will get worse, deteriorate, because we can't monitor that. So the severity is not only one factor can explain it.
It's not SARS-CoV-2. You can get other coronavirus. Every year, actually, it's 20% of the common colds caused by coronavirus.
How to disinfect my grocery, how to disinfect the environment that I'm setting, the table and everything. This was the important part, because we have a lot of debate in that. Very clear, the information was very transparent, the question has been answered professionally the way it should be.
Dozens of other Sudanese employees also joined the session through video conference. He Weiwei, CGTN, Khartoum.
Let's bring you some news coming in. The funeral ceremony is underway for George Floyd, the Black American whose death in police custody has caused more than 2 weeks of protests. The ceremony is taking place in Houston. He will be laid to rest at the Houston Memorial Gardens next to his mother. Meanwhile, Floyd's family lawyer has sent a request to the United Nations appealing for intervention in the investigation into his killing. Floyd's death has led to global rallies calling for an end to systemic racism and police violence.
Jesus, my joy in sorrow, hope for tomorrow. Jesus,
Those are live pictures coming to us from Houston, where the funeral ceremony is underway for George Floyd, the Black American whose death in police custody has caused more than 2 weeks of protests in the United States and across the globe. Now, like many African countries, Nigeria has been easing its COVID-19 lockdown. But the paradox is that positive cases are on the rise in the country. In most parts, life appears to have returned to normal, with people hardly complying with government guidelines. Here's CGTN's Deji Badmus with the situation in the capital, Lagos.
Nothing here suggests this is a city that is the epicenter of COVID-19 in Nigeria. This is a market in the heart of Lagos. Social distancing thrown to the wind. You could actually count the number of people wearing face masks or having them around their chin. Everyone here seems to be completely oblivious of a virus that has killed over 300 in the country and is still not showing any sign of slowing down. It's the norm across major markets in the city, which accounts for half of Nigeria's COVID-19 cases. And it's not just in the markets. This bus is in clear violation of the city's COVID-19 guidelines on public transportation. Commercial buses operating in the city are supposed to carry 60% of their load capacity, with all the passengers putting on face masks. but the guidelines are hardly complied with. And for some, there's a reason.
The reason we don't wear face masks is because we believe the issue of COVID-19 in Nigeria is a scam. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I don't believe it exists in Nigeria. This is my reason. When Nigeria was recording fewer cases, we were compelled to stay at home. But now that the situation has worsened and the number of cases is going up, we have been told the lockdown is being eased. So I believe it's a lie. I have my mask here, but I'm only holding onto it to avoid police harassment. I don't wear it again. I just keep it in my pocket.
As unbelievable as that might sound, it's a view held by many across Nigeria. And it's part of the reasons why many on the streets are not complying with government's COVID-19 guidelines. The situation is giving health experts serious cause for concerns, more so because Lagos is currently battling a widespread of community transmission of the virus.
If the precautionary measures are maintained, we will be able to curtail further transmission, because now we have very active community transmission, very, very active community transmission, particularly amongst the asymptomatic cases. And that has been possible because of the fact that people are not adhering to the public health instructions.
The government was very clear when it started to ease the lockdown. In addition to hand hygiene, people are required to wear face masks in public spaces, and more importantly, maintain social distance of at least 2 meters. But in a city with a land area of less than 1,000 square kilometers and a population of over 20 million, getting people to avoid each other is such a huge task.
This thing that we are using is not our culture. We are just managed to use it. And because if you use this thing, this face mask, you cannot breathe well.
As the government eases the lockdown further, people seem to be getting the wrong notion that things have returned to normal. And so they're throwing caution to the wind and reverting to their usual lifestyle. The government will no doubt need to double up on its public awareness campaign in order to really get people to begin to do what is needed to defeat COVID-19 in the city. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
And Sealy, Nigeria, the demand for second-hand clothing has dropped drastically, and that's largely because of coronavirus concerns. Local residents fear that the virus can be transmitted through imported clothing brought into the country from Asia, Europe, and the United States. CGTN's Tulisha Balala has more.
Yaba Market used to be bustling with people in Nigeria's commercial capital, Lagos. Since the government eased lockdown restrictions, there has been few customers visiting stalls here. The market is known for selling second-hand goods, but many wholesalers are struggling to make ends meet.
So people are no longer buying because of what they believe, that when you buy second-hand clothing, that you contact the disease. So, but it is not truth.
On a normal day, we make like, let me say 100K, make 150K, you get in a day. But since the outbreak of the virus, 30, before you even get 40s by the grace of God, because the outcome of people is on the shortage. You get, so that's what I feel is really affecting the business.
In 2018, Nigeria imported over $135 million in used clothing. It was the 6th largest importer in the world. Its major markets were the United Kingdom, South Korea, and China. Second-hand clothes were particularly popular to Nigerians who live under $1 a day.
We can't do entirely without importing these materials. We use fairly used electronics, fairly used clothes, fairly used furniture, and this has become a part of the lives of many people even before COVID-19 came up. So definitely what we need to do now is to make sure that as these items are getting imported, even at the customs or at this point of entry, you institute barriers. There are disinfectants, we have disinfecting sprays, disinfecting solutions, scans, checks. So what we need to do is to make practical protocols, easy guidelines that people can easily follow.
With Nigeria recording over 12,000 cases of coronavirus, it will take months for second-hand clothing businesses to thrive again. Thuli Shabalala, CGTN.
Somalia has been dealing with the aftermath of climate-related disasters in recent years. The coronavirus pandemic is now threatening to further disrupt the food supply chains near the country's capital, Mogadishu. CGTN's Abdulaziz Bilo has more now from Mogadishu.
Extreme weather has affected food production in Somalia. The United Nations says that up to 4 million people are in need of food assistance. A cycle of drought, flash floods and tropical cyclones has affected farmers and pastoralists. But a desert locust infestation is threatening to cause more harm, further worsening the country's humanitarian crisis.
Climate change has become the biggest challenge for us as farmers. We have noticed heavy rains in recent years. In the past years, we experienced average rainfall, but now we see climate change in various locations. This has impacted food production, and we can no longer depend on harvests.
We lost our harvest to flash floods and heavy rains last year, and this year we lost it to desert locusts. We are returning back to our farms, hoping to plant again, with the hope that we will get something in return.
Along with continued insecurity, climate shocks are also impacting infrastructure. In parts of the south and central regions of Somalia, transportation has been paralyzed with roads destroyed, denying farmers the ability to take their produce to markets in major towns. Coronavirus restrictions has also seen a steady decline in supplies to markets. The country's capital accounts for nearly 70% of all active COVID-19 infections. As a result, the virus has created disruptions, with farmers not willing to travel to urban centers in fear of contracting the infectious disease.
Achieving food safety is possible only when the government, private sector, and relevant agencies work together. Everyone has responsibilities to ensure that what is sold in the market doesn't cause harm to our population. We plan to support the private sector and raise awareness on the importance of food safety.
In April, Mogadishu unveiled a safety net program funded by the World Bank. The program seeks to target more than 200,000 households with life-saving assistance as part of efforts to assist the vulnerable and those hardest hit by the coronavirus pandemic. Abdulaziz Bilo, CGTN, Mogadishu, Somalia.
And let's now go to Uche Okronko for a look at the day's business news. Uche.
Thanks, Beatrice. And coming up on Africa Live Biz, Emirates lays off hundreds of its employees in a second phase of job cuts. And the city of New York reopens after nearly 3 months of a lockdown.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Well, let's start off in the aviation sector. The world's biggest long-haul carrier, Emirates, has fired about 600 pilots in what's been seen as one of the largest layoffs in the airline industry. According to reports, most of the pilots that have been dismissed were probationary first officers doing an Airbus A380 type rating. The Dubai-based airline also plans to retire a large part of its fleet. Now, the decision is due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which has brought the travel industry to a standstill. Emirates is currently ramping up its return to these skies with the resumption of passenger flights to about 30 cities, including the relaunch of its transit operations. And turning to Nigeria now, where domestic airlines are expected to resume operations on June 21st. Flights will only be able to carry about 50 to 70% of a plane's total passenger capacity. Here's CGTN's Deji Badmus with more on how these new coronavirus restrictions will affect the country's aviation sector.
Over 120 aircraft have been grounded at airports across Nigeria for months now as a result of the country's COVID-19 lockdown. For an aviation industry player like Gabriel Olowo, who heads a body of aviation experts in Nigeria, the announcement of the resumption of operations is a very cheering news.
We've been strategizing, especially on how not to spread the virus. From all stakeholders, the airport, the ticketing office, the customs, immigration, and all that are involved, in the value chain. We've been talking. And I think we have templates on ground. What we need to do now is to walk the talk. Let's now see how ready we are to experiment the challenges of COVID.
Part of Nigeria's coronavirus mitigation strategy is a directive by the government that every flight must not exceed between 50 to 70% passenger capacity to allow for social distancing.
The demand of social distancing on board, where today's passenger is asking for the cheapest fare, you might need 70, 80, 90% load factor to break even. If you're going to need 80% load factor to break even, and social distancing demands that the aeroplane will be 50% at the same cost of doing business and at the same tariff that you are used to, it's not going to be possible.
There's every likelihood that fares may go up when flight operations eventually resume. But for a frequent flyer like Tony, fares are the least of his problems.
Yes, I'm more bothered about safety because I'm one of the frequent flyers, and I'd rather my safety comes first before the cost. That's the biggest issue we have. But I feel government should not leave it to the airlines alone. I feel government should come to their aid. That's the only way you can make the airlines to be able to survive this time we're in.
Aviation has been one of the sectors most impacted by Nigeria's coronavirus restrictions. Virtually all airlines have placed their employees on indefinite leave without pay. And even when flight operations begin later this month, it is certain that not all the employees will be recalled to work.
Because of what has happened and because of the fear that people have been developed in people, it is going to take them time before they begin to think of even traveling. And even if you are going to travel again, it is going to require some procedures. They might start asking you to bring certificate. They might ask you to, do social distances. And because of all those, protocols, some people might decide to say, I'm not even going to travel now.
The Nigerian Aviation Ministry estimates that for every day this lockdown has lasted, the cost on the country's aviation industry runs into almost $2 million daily. And even if airlines receive government support, it's still uncertain if they will find a viable financial path forward. Deji Badmus, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
And still in aviation matters, South African Airways business rescue practitioners have asked for another extension to publish their final rescue plan. This time it's due to unions requesting more time. The plan was supposed to be published on June 8th. Should the extension be granted, it will be made public on June 15th. Now with the details, here's CGTN's Angela Coppola.
The business plan was leaked on Friday and called on government to raise in the region of around $1.2 billion to settle the debts and capitalize a new airline. It's understood that that price tag was something that the government and specifically the Public Enterprises Minister, Pravin Gordhan, balked at. And he actually told the practitioners to go back to the drawing board. We do understand that the practitioners have had a meeting with the SAA Creditors Committee, but not with the Employees Committee. On that draft plan, the practitioners, of course, have now requested an extension to the 15th of June to revise the rescue plan and resubmit it. There's also no more news on the alternative plans being developed between the unions and the Public Enterprises Minister. Some analysts have suggested, though, that one of the better options is to wind up or wind down the airline, as this will provide staff with a better deal in terms of retrenchment packages. It's also understood that the unions aren't overjoyed by this latest delay. Incidentally, June 15 is the day that the local airlines start limited domestic services between Johannesburg, Durban and Cape Town. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, let's turn our attention to international news now. In the U.S., New York City has finally entered the first phase of its plan to lift all major COVID-19 restrictions. This comes after nearly 3 months of lockdown aimed at combating the pandemic. Now, the plan will allow non-essential retailers to reopen while allowing operations in construction, manufacturing and wholesale trade to resume. The city's subway service will also be running at 95% pre-pandemic levels. Up to 400,000 New Yorkers are expected to return to work this week, many of them in construction.
I'm so excited. Yay, we're back in business. Yay. It's been tough. You don't have the business coming in. It's been tough. And, just saying, it's not inexpensive to pay rent in New York City.
Now, the American business community is making efforts to support racial equality in the wake of protests over the killing of African-American George Floyd by a white Minneapolis police officer. SoftBank has announced a $100 million opportunity fund for minority-owned businesses in response to the protests that, of course, erupted in cities across America. The fund is drawing praise as an important step in the right direction for venture capital, which has historically underrepresented minorities. Meanwhile, Bank of America is committing $1 billion to address economic and social disparities heightened during the COVID-19 pandemic. The 4-year commitment will address problems in job training, health, small businesses, and housing. Twitter founder and CEO Jack Dorsey is donating about $3 million to former NFL quarterback turned activist Colin Kaepernick's group, which is known as Know Your Rights Camp. Dorsey says his donation to the group and a series of contributions to other organizations will be part of his Start Small Grants initiative, which was launched in April. Well, let's move on now. In the battle to curb the spread of the coronavirus, strict restrictions on physical contact have become the new normal, and that has dramatically changed the way we socialize and do business. Online services have now become an important part of our daily life, and for some businesses, a matter of survival. Here in Africa, the new realities that the pandemic presents could be the much-needed push towards becoming a digital economy.
Stuck in the house? Bored? Hungry? For most, the social isolation at the peak of coronavirus lockdown measures forced us to rely on online services for the most basic needs, our food, entertainment, and as a tool for interacting socially or doing business. Well, here in Africa, internet penetration still remains low. But it turns out COVID-19 could be helping to accelerate a change in attitudes towards online services. The debate amongst stakeholders is whether the sudden need for safety and cleanliness could be a game changer for Africa's e-commerce and fintech platforms. According to players in Africa's e-commerce and fintech space, they are seeing higher levels of consumer adoption. Popular online marketplace Jumia reported that demand for groceries and essentials grew fourfold in the first quarter compared to last year, with customer and seller interest spiking. Tech firm Okra, which is Africa's first API that essentially connects bank accounts to various apps, has now seen a 175% rise in demand since March 2020. As more companies digitize their services due to COVID-19. In May this year, a survey by MasterCard found that 70% of respondents in the Middle East and Africa now say they are using some form of contactless payment and plan to continue to do so post-COVID-19. Daniel Yu founded SocoWatch, a B2B e-commerce platform in East Africa that supplies informal shops and kiosks in low-income communities with various products. He says he's now signing up more shop partners and reporting a higher share of stock in local shops compared to traditional suppliers.
We've already seen a significant growth in our volumes over the past 2 months. At the same time, though, we have seen some struggles with shops in different countries and different communities. For example, in Uganda and Rwanda, which were under strict lockdown for most of April, we found that shops were actually decreasing their average purchases as a result of the drop in incomes in those communities. At the same time, what we've actually seen is even when shops are dropping their purchases overall, we as a supplier, SokaWatch as an e-commerce provider, their company, have actually increased our share of supply within those businesses.
An interesting twist is that SokaWatch is now using its network of shop owners as well as its technology to distribute e-vouchers to families in need during this pandemic.
So families are able to receive a SMS voucher that notifies them that they have $15 to go spend at a local retail shop to buy essential goods. When the families go to those are stores that are already using SokaWatch's technology and platform to get the goods for their shop, and they're able to actually verify and redeem that Soko cash that's being spent at their shop.
While Africa's consumers have begun to rely more on digital tools during this pandemic, even after lockdown measures ease, have those services become important enough to engineer a massive shift in social behavior on the continent and revolutionize its e-commerce and fintech space?
I know people have seen the miracle and the magic of tech and what it's done, but I think it's too preposterous to think that it's going to overwhelm and overhaul industries that have been there. Well, that might actually happen, but I don't see that in the foreseeable future. Just looking at the trends, for instance, let's look at example of e-commerce, for instance, and the Jumias, for example, and what they've been able to do. I think that in itself has demonstrated that there is room for that particular service to exist, and I think perhaps we might see more different flavors of the same tech going forward. There's another open space, especially on the unbanked population or part of the population that is still unresolved.
With physical distancing measures likely to remain in place in different forms, the world has shifted towards a new reality. No one is sure what the future could look like, and that could mean an abundance of post-pandemic opportunities for Africa's digital economy. Uche Okoronkwo, CGTN Africa.
Well, that is all for now on Africa Live Biz, but coming up later on Global Business Africa, we'll be looking at proposed COVID-19 regulations for Kenya's public transport sector. Of course, more on that coming up top of the hour. For now, it's back to you, Beatrice.
Uche, thank you. And we still have more news for you here on the program. Here's what's coming up in your sports news. Tunisian national football team resumes training for the first time since the coronavirus outbreak.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours? Sports Scene. Find your game. The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Panata, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
The Tunisian national football team has conducted its first training program since the global coronavirus outbreak. The team trained under stringent health protocols as a precautionary measure against the spread of COVID-19.
Strict measures were undertaken as Tunisian football team returned to training for the first time since March. The players' locker and changing rooms were fumigated and disinfected in advance, and journalists who turned up to cover the event had their temperature checked before being allowed into the stadium.
Confinement was, of course, a difficult period for the players and for their minds. 3 months of confinement, and now we return gradually for training. We are going to work closely with the players on a psychological level. We will work on some axes. Thankfully, we have a positive spirit in the group.
Not all members of the national team made this first training session. Those who did not travel to Tunisia sent their wishes to the team, expressing their desire to join the squad in the coming days. Some said they had missed their country and the ambience of the national team.
Thank God that the confinement was not for a long period. When we see what is happening all around the world, we can be happy about the epidemic situation in our country. We have passed this difficult situation and we're going back to our competitions.
With significant delays to international qualifiers for the Africa Cup of Nations, the interruption allowed head coach Monder Kaiba to hold camp for 13 players for a week.
The Champions League and many important competitions have stopped. Sure, we have problems with public sponsors because everything has stopped. But football matches will return and the championship in Tunisia will return soon. I hope that football will start again in Egypt so I can go back to my team, Zamalek.
Tunisia is among the first African nations to resume football training at the national level, despite the threat of coronavirus in the country. Tunisia has recorded 1,087 cases of COVID-19 so far. Despite this, the squad numbers will be extended to 26 players for 5 days from June 16th. Sadiq Shaban, CGTN.
The West Indies cricket squad have arrived in Manchester ahead of their 3-test tour of England. Every member of the 39-strong touring party, including 25 players, tested negative for COVID-19 before they set off on a charter flight to Manchester Airport. They were tested again at their new base at Emirates Old Trafford, where they will live and train in a biosecure environment for the vast majority of their 7-week stay. The first test will take in Southampton on July 8th before